I'm sure that you all give lectures, and I'm sure that you know what your students look like if they need a little bit of a shake. So if you need just a little bit of a shakeout from all of that talking, please have a wiggle, have a shake, just to wake up again for our next bit of our event. So good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I am Amanda Austin, as I was introduced. I work for a relatively new partnership called Equal Measures 2030. And I don't know, at the beginning of this decade, I don't know if it feels like it to you, but it feels like data is suddenly far cooler and sexier than it was about 10 years ago. And equally, it does feel like people are talking about data privacy, data for good, big data, right? It seems to be at the forefront of a lot of discussions. At the same time, as you can see from the very topic of this event, gender equality also seems like it's at a bit of a peak in dialogue. This feels a little bit more cyclical in nature to me, but nevertheless, it does feel like it's on the tip of the tongue of lots of people involved in development discussions at the moment. So I don't know if my partnership was just prescient in seeing these two trends and maybe seeing that they were coming down the track, or we were jumping on a bandwagon. But it's these two driving forces that brought together the members of the partnership, Equal Measures 2030. So we are driven by the content of the Sustainable Development Goals at our heart. And that's what really brought us together in the first place. And bringing sustainable development with data, with gender equality, creating a triangle between these three is what drives all of the organizations within this partnership. We saw that there was a lot of data out there. There was a lot of research, but actually a huge amount of it just simply wasn't being used effectively to drive policy change. And that's why this partnership is not a data collection initiative. We don't do research ourselves. We analyze the data that's already out there, the rich amount of data that's already out there, package it up in different ways, cut it, analyze it in different ways, and put it into the hands of gender equality advocates at regional and national level. Our partners are from the private sector and from civil society. You can see that they each bring something very different to the table. We have regional organizations of women's rights networks like Femnet in Africa, CLAREM in Latin America. We have big global campaigning organizations that know how to deliver a message with a punch, someone like One Campaign, for example, or Women Deliver. We also have much more thought leadership organizations like Data2X leading the thinking around what is gender data and how do we use it better. And of course, we have some of the big players like the Gates Foundation around the table who are, of course, leading a lot of thinking around gender equality and development. This is the group that came together to found this partnership. So how do we work? We work in three different ways. I'm really only going to focus on one today, but we package data, we analyze it. We work with gender equality advocates to improve their data literacy. And then we work and support, give both technical and financial support to women's rights organizations. I lead these second two areas of work on behalf of the organization, but actually, given the people in the room, what I'd really like to share with you is the main flagship product under this first pillar, which is the Sustainable Development Goal Gender Index. Now, bear with me, because I want to tell you a little bit about the design of this. I'm hoping that as researchers, as academics, this is going to be an important piece of information before I get into the results. So the Sustainable Development Goals are unique when they think about gender from the Millennium Development Goals. It doesn't just think about gender equality in the context of some of the things that you might clearly associate. Child marriage, for example, maternal mortality, parity of girls within school, parity of women within parliament, for example. It's much more holistic than that. So we actually looked across all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and looked at how do we understand the implications for each of these different areas for the achievement of gender equality. So there is a standalone gender equality goal. I'm sure all of you know it's SDG 5. But actually, there are indicators and targets related to outcomes for girls and women across this whole framework. The index that we have actually is the most comprehensive aligned to the SDGs that's out there at the moment. So it cuts across 14 of the 17 goals, and it includes 51 indicators, unlike the WEF index, which was referred to your quiz, which is a lovely communication product, but contains very, very few gender equality indicators. It's incredibly narrow in its understanding of gender equality. We have a much more comprehensive picture, and it can be seen as much more universal as well, because it looks at issues that are just as relevant to the global north as they are to the global south. It doesn't see gender equality as a problem over there and not back here at home with us. When we were designing this, we did a number of consultations with policymakers, who are our ultimate goal, target to reach for policy change, for change in investment. We spoke to over 600 gender equality advocates across different countries. We piloted it first in just 6 focus countries in order to really just test the concept. Does it work? How does it hang together? Does it really show reality on the ground? And I'm happy to say that it did, and then we did quite a few tweaks, learning from that first stage, and launched it in full for 129 countries in 2019, last summer. We were then audited by the Competence Centre on Composite Indicators and Scoreboards of the EU. So we've really gone through our paces here on the design of this index, and feel that it is an incredibly strong product that tells a balanced and cohesive story. So how is this unique? I touched on a few of them. It's relevant in that it is based on the priority issues identified by gender equality advocates and the way that policymakers have talked about the various gender equality issues that they're dealing with. It's comprehensive, so it looks not just, as I said, at those kind of low-hanging fruit or more sort of commonly known gender issues like child marriage, but actually looks at things like energy policy, tax, social policy, women in urban settings, right? Things that should have a gender equality lens because there is an impact that is specific to girls and women. It's policy focused in that, and this is quite an interesting differentiator, it doesn't just look at outcomes. Outcomes are of course incredibly important, but they move very, very slowly, as we all know. So it also includes indicators to do with laws and policies, with norms, with perceptions, things that can measure an enabling environment for gender equality overall, and are important proxy indicators for the kinds of slower change that might be seen on outcomes. It's aligned to the SDG framework, as I said, which is unique amongst many other gender indices. And ideally, you will agree, it is easy to use. Our goal is that data is communicated. So we chop and change and analyze it in lots and lots of different ways to try to make it useful to many different audiences. So where do our data come from? Where do we draw this from? Many of you may think, okay, well, why did you make this? Because there are already a set of official Sustainable Development Goal indicators. How does this add any value? Well, actually, of the Sustainable Development Goal indicators across all of the issues, across the whole framework, there are only 23% of them that have a gender component, so 53 of them. So most of the goals and targets in the SDGs are in fact gender blind. And many of those that are gender related are not actually ready to measure. So there are only about 20 indicators that are gender relevant, that have an established methodology and are collected across enough countries to really be looked at from a global perspective. So actually our index then was faced with quite a challenge when we were designing it and using both official indicators from the SDGs, but also then looking at complementary sources of data to be telling a more holistic story and filling in some of those data gaps that still exist in the official framework. So we've partnered with a number of different organizations to do that. We draw, of course, from official data sources like national statistics offices, UN agencies that have compiled data from national statistics offices or from DHS surveys. But we've also then worked with other research institutes, with NGOs. You can see a list of them here. And then, of course, other indices, like from the International Budget Partnership, for example. And crucially, and somewhat uniquely, from opinion polls, perceptions of safety walking alone at night, for example, in the area in which you live, is a really important indicator of gender equality. So we draw from all of these to create the STG Gender Index. What did we find in 2019? Here's our heat map. You can see it includes many of the world's countries, not all. Still significant data gaps. This shows, as you can tell, that all countries have areas of strength and weakness. And spoiler alert, as per our quiz, no country has achieved gender equality. Now, obviously, this is an index, right? So we create composite scores based on indicators. And we give scores from 0 to 100 for every country, for each indicator, for each goal, and then overall for the country. Anything above 90 is excellent. Anything 80 to 89 is good, 70 to 79 is fair, 60 to 69 is poor, and anything under 59 is very, very poor. So we visualize this in a number of different ways, and it starts to get into how can something like this be useful, this kind of a tool, okay? So I like to say, much to the chagrin of my head of data, that we're not in the data business, we're in the communicating data business. And so how we visualize things is crucial, and we work with a number of organizations to do that effectively, and particularly with Tableau, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. So there's a basic heat map. You saw that on the first slide. Very familiar to everyone. We also, though, like to try to cut our index data against other data sets. So looking at a country's results in comparison to their GDP or to their population data, and see what kinds of stories are maybe outperforming for their GDP or underperforming for their GDP levels. United States may, unsurprising to you, underperform on gender equality compared to its GDP. Up in this top corner, you can see the percentage of women and girls that live in different countries based on their score. 1.4 billion girls and women live in countries that get a very poor score on the SDG Gender Index. That's 40% of the girls and women around the world. We also show goals, scores by goal, which are here on this far right. So you can tell that some of the development issues that have received greater investment, that were a greater priority in the Millennium Development Goals, that tend to be in SDGs 1 through 6, things like water, things like health, things like education. Actually, you can see that more countries are tending to get a greener score on those, not surprising. And some of the quote-unquote newer development issues, right, things like climate, energy, economic empowerment, urbanization, tax policy, partnerships, open data, things like that, all of those which are somewhat newer, tend to be later in the SDG goals, and those tend to be orange or yellow, as you can tell. This shows that information in another way. So this looks at the achievement gap for each SDG, each goal within the SDG framework, globally. So again, unsurprisingly, we are closest to the targets in some of the most highly invested areas for development, and we are furthest from the targets in some of the issues that are somewhat newer or haven't necessarily had a gender lens applied to them, things like climate change, some of the issues within partnerships, but also really concerningly, SDG 5 on gender equality. You can see there is actually concerningly behind. And that includes issues such as child marriage, perceptions of domestic violence and whether that's acceptable, legal abortion, women's political participation, and women's representation within senior government positions. And you can see actually we're quite far behind globally on that one. Now, all of this data lives, and you get out your phones, but maybe after I finish talking, on something called the Gender Advocates Data Hub. The web address for that is data.em2030.org, which you'll see at the end of my presentation as well. That gives you an opportunity to cut and slice the data in lots of different ways. We're constantly trying to improve this, and we'll be doing quite a lot of fixes over the course of the year, but do have a play around on this. This shows one of the ways in which you can look at this data and why we think it's useful for advocates to be able to play with the data in this way. What this shows is the regional range of performance for sub-Saharan Africa on each goal. So the grayed out bars are the range of performance within sub-Saharan Africa, and the bubbles show the performance of Senegal within that. So what you can see here is the green line is the regional average across the region. You can see at the end here is Senegal's overall score, 52. That's very poor, anything under 59. But actually, if you were to just go to the Senegalese government with that story, I'm not sure you'd get a lot of traction. At least that's what our advocates would say. But what they can use is actually looking, Senegal is performing above average across its region on a number of these goals, actually. It's really doing quite well compared to its neighbors, except on some of these key issues, on SDG 1, on SDG 4, on SDG 8, so on work, on education, on poverty, on climate, it's really falling behind its peers. So we're able, by doing a sort of regional comparison like this, the advocates that we work within Senegal are able to do a certain amount of peer pressure on the government of Senegal within those particular issue areas to say, look, we're doing pretty well compared to our neighbors. We're making progress. But you know where we're not making progress at all is on these particular issues. We can do better. Progress is possible based on what our neighbors are achieving. Now, I picked out one issue within our index that I think might be most of interest to those within the room. Under the goal around innovation and infrastructure is an indicator around women in STEM, so science, technology, and maths research and research positions. So this is an interesting cut of the data, so stick with me. What we're plotting here is the percentage of women in STEM research positions along the bottom. And the bars are color-coded based on what percentage of GDP expenditure is on R&D within those countries. Okay. So interestingly, you see within Europe and North America that the highest performers in terms of percentage of women in STEM positions are not those that are spending the most on R&D. In fact, performance on this indicator doesn't even track to the overall performance on gender equality. In fact, it's the opposite. In general, across our index in all regions, the 10 worst performers overall within the region tend to perform best on this indicator, which is fascinating. Why is it that countries that are performing so poorly on gender equality overall are managing to get many more women into STEM positions? This is a question back to you, to be honest, because this is your area of expertise. So you tell me what's going on here, right? What is the contextual analysis? What are the stories behind this kind of performance? And this, in a way, brings me to my main passion within my work within the organization, which is teaming up with advocates, with experts within these particular thematic areas to draw out the contextual analysis, the stories, and the policy change needed within these particular issue areas. An index is a framing tool. Data alone doesn't change policy, right? Change on the ground, actors, activists, influencers, partnering together to get in the room with decision makers to demand change, specific to what their country needs, is what makes change. So we can give you this, and I encourage you to take it away, but we can give you this, and then you can decide what to do with it. What does it mean? What does it mean for the work of your organization? What does it mean for the way that, that Belgium is promoting women within these positions or not? So before I close, I have to just say one final thing, which is around data gaps. We have a section on our data hub that talks about this, but it's really crucial, and I'm sure it's crucial particularly to the researchers in the room. There are enormous questions still that are outstanding about the impacts of different issues on girls and women and how they affect them. Some of the really critical ones are around unpaid care work, for example. Massive, massive questions, right, around how is unpaid care work being valued or not valued within particular societies, how much is being lost by the fact that women need to stay home so much, often women, to be carers for children, for elderly. Women's access to and safety on public transportation is another big issue, and we don't have a lot of data on that. And it's certainly not available at a global level. It's certainly not available with a clear methodology that's established across many countries. Women's land tenure is another one. Comprehensive sexuality education is another one. We could go on, and there's a huge list. There's also enormous data gaps when it comes to this issue of intersectionality, and it was mentioned by a few. Girls and women, of course, are not homogenous. So where are the most marginalized groups of girls and women performing on these issues? It would, of course, be much further behind for almost all countries that we're looking at, right? Girls and women from minority backgrounds, from ethnic minorities, from linguistic minorities. Their performance is usually far behind that, but actually we don't have the data to be able to present that information in the kind of way that we're able to do so at a national level, at an aggregate level. So we have to mention data gaps, because otherwise it's so easy to think that this index shows the full picture, and of course it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. So, what's my call to action? What's your so what out of this? For me, the takeaway here is that data and research is so often underutilized, underused. It could become so much more powerful. I'm sure this is a frustration for all of you when you spend years on certain research projects and it goes into a glorious paper and glorious charts, and they sit on a bookshelf, right? What we're trying to do here is to say that there is so much rich data out there. Of course there can be more, but there is so much rich data and information and research out there, and we can package it up in different ways, we can visualize it differently, and those change agents on the ground in our countries and in the global south can be using that to power their advocacy, to make their influencing significantly more impactful. And it's through partnerships with research organizations, with academia, with partnerships like mine, that can make that kind of a change reality. Thank you for your time.